We've derived that the short-run aggregate supply curve is most likely upward sloping. The chances are there's a positive relationship between total output Y and the price level P. Now we can combine that with Oken's law that we saw in chapter 10 to get our Phillips curve. Our Phillips curve simply says that inflation, or the change in prices, is going to be a function of expected inflation, how high we think inflation is going to be, as well as cyclical unemployment. This is where we're incorporating Oken's law, which basically says that when the economy is doing well and output is very high, unemployment is going to be quite low. Or when unemployment is quite high, chances are the economy is doing poorly. And cyclical unemployment is specifically deviations in the unemployment rate from that natural rate that we derived in chapter 7. The Phillips curve also says that inflation can depend on supply shocks, as well as this exogenous constant beta that's going to relate unemployment to inflation. And so in this Phillips curve, we can see that when unemployment is very high compared to the natural rate, that's going to push inflation down because we're subtracting beta here. So really high unemployment is going to mean really low inflation. On the contrary, if we have very low unemployment, that's going to push inflation up. And so pi is going to be very high when u is very low. So we can take this and compare that to our short-run aggregate supply curve and see that they largely tell the same story. Our short-run aggregate supply curve shows that changes in price from expectations can push output above potential for a short period of time. So when P is very high, chances are output is also very high. Our Phillips curve tells largely the same story, except with unemployment. The Phillips curve says that if unemployment is very low, chances are, because output is very high, that low unemployment is going to lead to really high inflation. Similarly, if unemployment is well above the natural rate, chances are inflation is very low. But either way we look at it, the short-run aggregate supply curve and the Phillips curve largely tell the same story. We're stuck with this expected inflation term in the Phillips curve. We need to define how people set their expectations. One way that people can set their expectations is through adaptive expectations. Basically, the idea that people assume that the future is going to be very similar to the past. They're going to form expectations of future inflation based on recently observed inflation. And so traditionally, just for simplicity, we incorporate adaptive expectations by saying that expected future inflation is just whatever last year's inflation was. This is the same thing as me asking you what the weather was going to be tomorrow and you telling me what the weather was yesterday. But it makes the Phillips curve far simpler. And so we can incorporate adaptive expectations into the Phillips curve by replacing expected inflation with just last year's inflation. And so we can do that by replacing e pi with pi of -1, inflation from last year. We can see that we now don't have expectations at all in our Phillips curve. But what this means is that inflation now has inertia. Inflation this year is influenced by inflation last year. Thus, if inflation last year was very high, that's going to mean inflation this year is going to tend to be quite high. If inflation last year, on the contrary, was very low, pi -1 is very low, chances are inflation this year is going to be very low. And so if we keep unemployment at its natural rate, if u is constantly un, and we don't have supply shocks, that means inflation is always going to stay steady. So really high inflation would continue forever in this case, but really low inflation would also continue forever. And so past changes in inflation have a constant influence on current inflation. Inflation begins to feed on itself. And so really high inflation last year leads to high inflation this year, and high inflation this year leads to high inflation next year, and so on and so forth. But the inflation in this case goes through this self-perpetuating cycle. And so clearly we're going to need to define two different kinds of inflation. Basically inflation that comes from the supply side and inflation that comes from the demand side. We need to clear up where inflation comes from. So keeping this same Phillips curve with adaptive expectations, we could have cost push inflation, basically just inflation or rises in prices that come from supply shocks. And so if V is very high, if we suddenly have a really high supply shock, that leads to really high inflation. We talked in chapter 10 about that example where oil prices suddenly spiked and that led to really high inflation. In this case, that's the same as that leftward shift in the short run aggregate supply curve and pushing up prices. This is cost push inflation, where inflation goes up just because supply has gone down. But on the other side of that, we could also have demand pull inflation. We could have inflation go up just because people want to spend more. And so we saw in the last couple of chapters how a rightward shift in demand led to higher prices. That's demand pull inflation. That's more people wanting to spend more, slowly pulling price level up and slowly pushing the unemployment rate down. So all of this can shift the Phillips curve up and down. Basically, people can change their expectations over time in response to these different shocks, in response to demand shocks and supply shocks. And so if we say that people suddenly increased their inflation expectations, that can shift the entire Phillips curve upward. So if we say that there was a sudden supply shock like we saw in the 1970s, that can shift the entire Phillips curve. Graphically, it's going to look something like this. So instead of having price on the y-axis, we now have inflation on the y-axis and unemployment on the x-axis. And so if we began with this initial downward sloping Phillips curve, with a natural rate of unemployment right here, we can say that expected inflation occurred right there. That we expected inflation at the natural rate. But if suddenly we decide that there's probably going to be more inflation next year, basically if we decide that e pi 2 is greater than e pi 1, that shifts up what we think inflation is going to be at the natural rate. It shifts that entire Phillips curve upward. And so this change in expectations can very quickly shift the entire Phillips curve. And so we can now have a higher level of inflation at that same natural rate of unemployment. And so we can see how the influence of expectations is very clear for actual realized inflation. If people begin to expect more inflation, they actually see more inflation. And thus the Phillips curve itself can shift over time.